The risks have inevitably gone up because the possibility that they might think that they could do this and succeed are greater than they were in the past.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Kohn, executive producer. According to Princeton's Friedberg, the West's strategy of engagement with China has failed. More than 3 decades of trade and investment with the advanced democracies have left that country far richer and stronger than it would otherwise have been. But growth and development have not caused China's rulers to relax their grip on political power, abandoned their mercantilist economic policies, or accept the rules and norms of the existing international system. To the contrary, China today is more repressive at home, more aggressive abroad, and more obviously intent on establishing itself as the world's preponderant power than at any time since the death of Chairman Mao. So what went wrong? Put simply, the democracies underestimated the resilience, resourcefulness, and ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party. For far too long, Friedberg believes the United States and its allies failed to take seriously the party's unwavering determination to crush opposition, build national power, and fulfill its ideological and geopolitical ambitions. In his 2022 book, Getting China Wrong, Friedberg identifies the assumptions underpinning engagement, describes the counter-strategy that China's Communist Party rulers devised in order to exploit the West's openness while defeating its plans, and explains what the democracies must do now if they wish to preserve their prosperity, protect their security, and defend their common values. Today, I talk with Friedberg about the biggest Western misconceptions about China, the current state of the Chinese regime, both politically and economically, and what we in the West should be focused on in the coming years. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Aaron L. Friedberg is professor of political and international affairs at Princeton University. Over the past 2 decades, he has written numerous books and articles warning of the dangers of an intensifying economic, military, and ideological rivalry between China and the West, including A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia, Beyond Air-Sea Battle, the debate over U.S. military strategy in Asia, and Partial Disengagement, a new U.S. strategy for economic competition with China. His most recent book, published in 2022, is Getting China Wrong, which we'll discuss today. Aaron Friedberg, welcome to Acton Line.
Thank you very much.
So your latest book, which is Getting China Wrong, which is out in 2022, paperback was out late last year, 2023. Aaron, what prompted you to write this book? What do you think we're getting wrong about China?
What prompted me to write the book was years of observing and in varying ways participating in the debate over our China policy. A degree of frustration, I have to admit, over time with what I saw as misperceptions and mistakes that were being made along the way. I don't know that there was any one particular turning point in this. It's more an accumulation of things. And the single most important thing that I think we've gotten wrong over the years is underestimating the resilience and the resolve and the ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party and its determination to hold on to political power. And I think a great deal else follows from that. And yet, over the years, our policy at times has been based on the assumption that the CCP would mellow and eventually go away. And obviously that hasn't happened.
Where do you think that assumption came from? Why was there this presumption that either the CCP would mellow or that engagement in trade with China, their membership in the WTO, would eventually mean some kind of moderation or at least a marked change in the nature of the relationship between the United States and China and most of the West and China?
I think it's a confluence of sort of theory and practice. On the practice side, or the practical side, this policy or strategy that emphasized engagement really takes hold in its current form in the aftermath of the Cold War. And really, as I describe in the book, it's in the early 1990s that the various arguments that have been developed over the years to justify a policy of engagement with China emerge and take hold. And of course, that's a moment of triumphalism. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fragmentation of the Soviet Empire, the fragmentation of the Soviet Union. This was a moment, it seems difficult to recall at times, when serious people like Frank Fukuyama argued that history was coming to an end and that liberal democratic capitalism had proven itself as the dominant form of political and economic organization. So it's things that are happening, and watching these dramatic events in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, I think, encouraged people to believe that something similar might very well be just around the corner in China. And then there's also theory, if you like, or belief that certain things had to be true. One belief in particular, that economic growth and the increase in incomes and the growth of the middle class would lead inevitably to political liberalization in China, and that's something that had happened previously in Europe in the 19th century, in Asia in the 20th century. And there were good, again, sort of theoretical explanations for why we might expect that to be true. Basically, to simplify, when people have the choice about what cereal to buy or where to live or where to work, they are eventually going to want to have a say in choosing their leaders. And again, this was something that had apparently been proven by events. So it's that expectation as well. And the belief that China was already well launched on that path, despite, of course, what had happened in 1989 at Tiananmen, which ought to have suggested that perhaps things were not working as we might have hoped. But there was a lot of optimism. I think there's one other factor I should mention, which is, again, starting in the early 1990s, there's a confluence of interests in the United States, in the West, interest groups that support a policy of extensive and intensive, particularly economic engagement with China, because people stood to benefit from that. Trade would be beneficial to their interests. They would have an opportunity to sell their products into a very large Chinese market. They would also have the opportunity to take advantage of China's very large, relatively low-wage labor force to move some of their productive facilities into China. And for those reasons, you get a kind of strong lobby or group of lobbies that support engagement and continue to support it in some respects down to the present.
If you look at the way that totalitarianism unraveled in the Soviet Union and Europe and the examples that you were pointing to, what was the base for the theoretical case that similar changes could be anticipated in China? What made China different? Why do you think that theory didn't work out? What was characteristically different about China and its leadership in the Chinese Communist Party that prevented that from happening?
Well, one thing that I think was important was the example of the Soviet Union. So the Chinese leadership, observing what had happened to the Soviets, was very determined that the same thing should not happen to them. And so from the beginning of this process of engagement, they're constantly concerned about the possibility that engagement will undermine their power. And they're looking for ways to guard against that and to prevent that from happening. The CCP leadership, I think it's fair to say, has been obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is certainly true of Xi Jinping. He's given speeches about it. They've held party conferences where they discuss the lessons of of the Soviet case, and so they've learned from that. I think that's part of the explanation. I think in part, perhaps as a result of that, the CCP developed techniques for controlling and observing their population, which exceeded the capacities of the Soviets. That's partly a technological thing. They had available to them possibilities for monitoring the communications of their people, for example, that the Soviets didn't have. So that helped. The other thing, I guess, about China is in this 30-some year period that we're talking about, China was on the uphill trajectory. It was growing very rapidly. And that had begun in the late 70s and early 80s when Deng Xiaoping emerges as the new Chinese leader after Mao's death and begins what he calls his process of reform and opening up. So use of market mechanisms to stimulate growth. And he does it very deliberately in the hopes that by improving the livelihood of Chinese people, it will be possible to affirm their support for the Communist Party. And for a time, and arguably even down to the present, that's successful. By contrast, the Soviet system was in a prolonged deterioration. Its growth slowed by the late 60s and early 70s. And then there ensued a period of a decade and more of economic stagnation. So the population became increasingly disenchanted with the regime, and even the leadership of the Soviet Union began to become demoralized. And down to the present, that has not been true in the case of China. Incomes have been rising. People have been supportive of the regime. The leadership has been optimistic, and I think is still optimistic about its prospects. So they were going in different directions. The Soviet Union down, China up, at least for the time being.
How important was that break from doctrinaire Marxism, the full embrace of Marxist economic thought that you saw in the Soviet Union that one could argue really laid the groundwork for its demise? You have in China this case where they've engaged in market liberalization, that they have opened up, that they trade with the rest of the world. How important was this abandonment of ideological Marxist economic doctrine? And how should it make us think about a communist party, or something that still goes by the name of a communist party, that from an economic perspective is really not communist anymore?
Yes, that's extremely important. Their flexibility, their ability to abandon or to substantially modify some portions of the doctrine that they had inherited is the reason that they're still around. I think by contrast, the Soviets were rigid, didn't have the foresight, didn't have the imagination to even consider the possibility of some of the reforms that have taken place in China until the very last minute. Gorbachev comes along right at the end, realizing that the Soviet system isn't working, that communism, basically in its doctrinaire form, isn't working, and begins a series of desperate experiments with the economy and then also with the political system that lead very quickly to the unraveling and the collapse of the system. By contrast, the CCP leadership has been much more flexible. And that's really one of the most striking characteristics, I think, of the regime and its policies over the last 30 or 40 years. Willingness to experiment and to move at least a certain degree, a certain part of the way towards a true market-based system without ever going all the way, while maintaining political control, allowing market forces to operate and to their benefit. That is part of the reason why they were able to grow so rapidly. The other part of it, and you mentioned this, is their willingness to be open to trade and investment with the rest of the world. Here too, the Soviets were doctrinaire down almost to the end, believing that economic engagement with capitalist countries would corrupt and subvert the rule of the Soviet Communist Party, and they really isolated themselves for most of the Cold War. I mean, we did too by refusing to a significant degree to trade and invest with them, but they brought it on themselves. Whereas in the case of China, the regime was very willing to engage with the rest of the world economically. Again, once Deng Xiaoping comes in, recognizing that this is a way of getting capital, it's a way of getting technology, and very importantly, as China grows, it's a way of having access to an external market into which China can sell its goods and profit as a result. So a willingness to engage with the rest of the world, which the Soviet system, again, didn't have almost to the end. They start to, because they're desperate, accept some loans from the West, but very little, and it's too little and too late. But from the beginning, the CCP leadership recognizes that doing this is potentially dangerous. Deng Xiaoping famously said in conversation with some of his colleagues at the beginning of this process, when you open the windows, fresh air comes in, but so do flies. So the fresh air is the engagement with the markets of the world and all of that that can bring with it. The flies are the corrupting and dangerous ideas of liberal democracy. And he was alert to that. And he and his successors have adopted and adapted over time a mix of policies meant to maintain control of the population. And here, too, they've been very experimental. They've been willing to try different things, always, though, with the ultimate goal of maintaining political control. And really, they've had a package of policies, if you like. And at different times, there's been greater or lesser emphasis on different parts of this. One, obviously, repression. They've never abandoned that. And to the contrary, they've kind of refined the techniques and the technology of repression over time. Two is co-optation. So in particular, economic co-optation, offering the promise of a better life. If people will remain loyal to the regime, they will benefit and profit, and their lives will become better over time. That's been true up until now, but maybe it's not going to be true in future. And then the third element in this program is nationalism. And here, too, there's a variant from Marxism in its classical form, which is anti-nationalist and purports to be internationalist. And here, too, Deng Xiaoping is the great innovator. He, in fact, says in conversation with some of his generals after Tiananmen in 1989, our big mistake, the failing of the last decade or so, has been not to maintain, he doesn't use the phrase, but hearts and minds of our people, in particular our younger people. And he says the way that we have to do that is by encouraging a sense of patriotism. And China begins a program of what comes to be referred to as patriotic education, starts in the 1990s. It's expanded and grown over the years. And that is a form of nationalist indoctrination. The party presented a particular version of China's history in which the villains were the Western powers, the capitalists who, going back to the 19th century, had intruded on China and caused disorder and suppressed the Chinese people. And the heroes of the story are the Chinese Communist Party, which liberated China, created the modern People's Republic of China, and which, in the party's telling, is still essential to China's future prospects. And they've indoctrinated successive generations of children and older people with those beliefs. And if we've learned anything since the end of the Cold War, it's that nationalism is an extraordinarily powerful force. And the CCP has captured it and used it for its purposes, even though, technically that was at odds with Marxist doctrine.
How are things going in China right now, both politically and economically? And I guess maybe even the more important part of that question is, how do we know, and how reliable is any of the information we get? I know some of the China scholars that I read, particularly on the economic front, are always very quick to caveat any of the stories about the performance of China's economy, which is, if you can believe the numbers from China, which you can't, here's what's going on.
Yeah.
So what sense do we have of how things are going, both politically, the kind of package of policies that you've described to maintain the political rule of the Chinese Communist Party, and economically, and what level of confidence do we have in this analysis based on the information walls that exist between us and them?
It's a very good question. Let's start with the political part. We don't know much about what goes on at the very highest levels of the system. It's very closed, very difficult to know exactly what's going on. And I suspect it's become even more so because it appears, and I think it is the case, that power has become even more tightly concentrated into the hands of a tiny group and really into the hands of a single man, Xi Jinping. And so we don't know. There is no evidence that I find persuasive that's emerged over the last several years of any kind of dissension or division at the upper levels of the party. You occasionally hear stories that are second and third hand of dissatisfaction on the part of some people in the elite, but that, as far as we can see, that has no practical manifestation. At times, including when Xi Jinping first came to power back in 2012, 2013, there were rumors that there were coups, and later that he had made various people very unhappy because of the purges that he's undertaken, and that therefore there must be opposition to him. And yet, as a practical matter, there is no evidence of that. Doesn't mean that there couldn't be, or that things could change perhaps rapidly. But for the moment, Xi Jinping is clearly in charge, and there's no evidence of any dissent. And in fact, he's tightened his grip. He essentially appointed himself to a third term as the party leader in 2022, and there was no opposition to that. Moreover, as part of that process, he kind of swapped out people in the leadership who were not as clearly beholden to him and replaced them with people who were. So he seems to control from the top down. The next set of questions about what's going on politically, I guess, has to do with evidence of broader dissent or unhappiness. And there again, there is little, but not zero, evidence that people in China have been unhappy with various policies that the party has pursued. And I think the most dramatic example that gives some evidence of that unhappiness is what happened at the end of 2022, when the party suddenly abandoned its so-called zero COVID policy. And after the pandemic began, the party cracked down and imposed lockdowns in Chinese cities, and they do seem to have escaped the worst effects of the first waves of the virus. But then later, when some of these somewhat less potent but more transmissible variants emerged in 2022, 2021, 22, that didn't seem to be working. They cracked down even harder. And as they did so, there began to be some indications of real unhappiness. And here, it's important to say that this is, for the most part, it's not political dissent. It's not people saying we need multi-party democracy and get rid of the regime. It's people crying out, almost in desperation, because of the terrible straits in which they find themselves as a result of the party's brutal and not very effective attempts to control the spread of the disease. There were videos taken from the balcony of apartments, I think in Shanghai, where at night people would come out onto their balconies, apparently, and bang pots and pans, and you could hear it across the city. There were even a few cases of brave souls who unfurled banners that were critical of Xi Jinping, of the regime. And as a result of that, apparently, the regime turned on a dime, abandoned this policy that had been proclaiming as a great success in comparison to the effectlessness of Western democracies, and dropped these COVID lockdowns and essentially let the virus burn its way through the population. We don't know exactly how many people died, but it probably was 1 million plus. But they abandoned it. They abandoned the policy because of popular unhappiness, and also because of the economic effects of these lockdowns. So there's a recent example in which, at the extreme, if people are sufficiently unhappy, they may express that, and it could conceivably have an impact on policy. But that's not what's going on day by day. 10 years ago, maybe when Xi Jinping came in, there might have been more instances in which people posted things on social media that were critical. That's really been squelched. I think Xi has stamped out all of the visible manifestations of popular unhappiness, with the exception of these occasional extraordinary events. So Xi Jinping's in charge, the party is in charge, and the party state apparatus appears to be rigidly in control. One thing to mention here, because you brought up the issue of how do we know, into the first decade of the 21st century, the party state apparatus would issue statistics every year recording the number of so-called mass incidents. And these are protests, demonstrations of over 100 people or over 1,000 people. I don't remember which it was. Almost all of these have to do with wages that haven't been paid, or protests by farmers who are being moved off their land so somebody can build an apartment complex there. And so they recorded these. And when the number of mass incidents in a year reached, I think it was 72,000, they stopped reporting the statistics. And there are people who have been trying to, reconstruct those statistics, and they showed the curve continuing to go up, at least as of a few years ago. I haven't seen most recently, but we don't really know. But there are instances in which people turn out and complain about something that's going on in their neighborhoods, basically. As far as what's happening economically, there's no doubt that China's growth has slowed. They went through a couple decades of double-digit growth, 10% growth or around there, which is just extraordinary. And especially as the volume of the size of the Chinese economy grows, 10% year on year is just an enormous increment each year of additional growth. That period of rapid growth has come to an end. It's not just in the last few years, but over the last decade. So we went down 6-7%. And it has come down even further. And the party has acknowledged that, although they continue to sort of cook the books and make claims about sort of steady growth that's gradually coming down in a very systematic way. There, I don't think many Western observers are confident anymore of the official statistics. They probably should have been more wary of them all along, but I think there's a growing awareness that they can't be relied upon. But we don't know exactly how slow China's growth is at the moment. And more importantly, I think, is the question of what the trajectory is going to be going forward. It's possible that, in fact, China's growth has dropped pretty dramatically, and it's not 6-7%. Maybe it's 2-3%. And also, it's possible that it may not go back up very much. And so China may now have entered into a period of really quite slow growth. I mean, compared to Western advanced industrial societies, 2-3% looks great. But compared to China's recent past, that's quite slow. But the party is not giving information that would confirm that. One thing that's notable is that the leadership, Xi Jinping in particular, has recently said, in effect, growth isn't everything. The purpose of our economic policy, or the purpose of our national policy, is not just to increase GDP year on year. Yes, we're improving the well-being of the Chinese people, but we shouldn't be obsessed with these growth targets, which is how the party measured itself in the past. But that's quite notable, saying to people, listen, don't expect that we're going to be able to deliver quite what we did in the past. But there are big issues, perhaps we can talk about those, as to whether the party is going to be able to come up with a sustainable growth model to replace the one that they've been using for the last several decades. The last thing I wanted to mention, though, is, it's, again, an issue about which there are real questions and on which the data is not reliable, is unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment. So I believe as of last year, by official measures, something like 20 or 21% of young people below a certain age unemployed. And of course, that's a huge number. And there too, the party stopped reporting the statistics because that's obviously not a very successful performance. So we don't know for sure, but we have reason to think that, at least for the moment, there's high unemployment. That would be particularly in cities. Another thing that I don't think we have adequate information on is really the quality of life outside of the cities, in the countryside. And remembering that, a substantial fraction of China's population is still rural. It may be half. It's like 600, maybe 700 million, which would be about half. And overall, quality of life in the countryside has been lower than in the cities. And there's reason to think that as growth slows, and particularly growth slows in the cities, to which many people from the country had flowed in order to work, those people are going to be coming back to the countryside without jobs, without incomes. The quality of life was never great. It was never as high in the countryside as in the city. But if things are slowing down overall, probably even worse in the countryside. And there too, it's hard to get reliable information because the regime doesn't want people on the outside to see their problems.
Unpack what you referenced just a few minutes ago with a sustainable growth model for China going forward. So looking at the explosion of growth that they got after liberalizing markets and opening up trade with the rest of the world, they get this high growth. It has now started to stagnate. What do you think the prospects are that they're able to land upon some kind of a successful model that allows them to grow and then head off a lot of the economic concerns that you were just outlining and potentially the political downstream concerns from those economic problems?
That's really 64 billion is too small.
Yeah,
that's
trillion?
Really trillion. It's probably more than that question. So, and that has to be a central, maybe the central preoccupation for the leadership right now. Just to back up a step, thinking about how China was able to be as successful as it was in sustaining growth over a long period of time, I think there's general agreement that the model of growth that China adopted and pursued over a period of decades relied very heavily on two things. One was enormous increments of investment, and particularly investment in physical infrastructure, so roads, bridges, railways, but also apartment complexes, whole cities, whole towns built not primarily to serve the needs of the population, but to employ people and to use the resources that are being generated by China's growing manufacturing base. So enormous increments of investment, and also very large increments of net exports. So they're pumping out exports to the rest of the world. The thing that they have not done, at least to the same degree as advanced industrial societies, is make the conversion to a consumption-driven economy. That's basically what's happened in all the advanced economies of the world. They've gone through a period when they had very high investment, and then the investment tapered off, and consumption grew as the population became more wealthy and had a larger share of the total output. And that's how they've sustained steady but lower rates of growth. So two things have happened. One, you can't keep pumping more and more into investment. At some point, the returns on investment go down, and that's clearly been happening in China for a while. The last bridge or the next bridge doesn't add very much to your total productivity and output. And if you keep building them, eventually you're just burning money.
Well, I know I've seen the videos too of some of these high-rise constructions. I'm never sure which cities they're in, but I know I've seen videos of some of them even being imploded and taken down. They're never finished, or at least never occupied.
Yes. I saw it. Maybe it was the same video. I saw it yesterday.
Yes.
I don't know what the source
was,
is or how recent it is, but they're blowing up looks like whole portions of cities because apparently they overbuilt. We know they overbuilt, and somebody decided eventually it was better to get rid of the things than just to leave them sitting there. So there's been this question about when and how investment was going to slow down. And China's been going through this property or real estate crisis in the last couple of years. People have anticipated this sort of bubble bursting for some time, and now it seems actually to have burst. So prices, the value of apartments are no longer going up, it's coming down. So they seem to have reached the limit of this heavily investment-driven growth. And maybe come back to that in a minute. In part, that appears to be the result of deliberate government policy. Until recently, the government seemed to have been afraid really to take the steps that it would need to take to burst that bubble. And so they haven't. And so it's continued to get bigger and bigger. Now they seem willing to kind of stand back and let it deflate. And the question will be, well, where are those resources going to go if it's not into yet more investment? The other thing that they're concerned about is whether they can continue to rely on the rest of the world to absorb greater and greater quantities of their manufactured goods. Here too, at some point, there's a limit because the population of the world is only so many billion people, and China can pump out more and more washing machines, but at some point, markets are saturated. Moreover, at least in the last several years, there's also been the question of whether the advanced democracies are going to be willing indefinitely to continue to absorb those exports. And we're seeing a crisis that's unfolding now, specifically focused on electric vehicles, which the Chinese have been manufacturing now in very large numbers, and which they appear to be unloading on European markets in particular in huge volumes, and which, if the Europeans don't do anything, will undercut and may destroy Europe's nascent electric vehicle manufacturing industry. And similar things have happened in the past, for example, with solar panels. The CCP regime subsidizes the manufacture of certain goods so they can be sold on global markets at under market prices. That destroys other manufacturers, and the Chinese manufacturers dominate the market. So the old model is bumping up against its limitations. I think that the preferred approach that the regime is following, I should say one other thing, which is it's been evident for a while that this limit was going to be reached. And Western economists and Chinese economists to a degree, and even some people in the CCP regime going back a decade or so, acknowledged this. Wen Jiabao, the premier under Hu Jintao, gave a speech in 2007 in which he said, our existing model is unsustainable, unbalanced. It's the four uns. I don't remember what the others were, but he's saying we need something new. He didn't come up with it, but there's been a recognition of this, and there really were two possibilities. One was to do what all the Western economists and the World Bank and other Western-based economic institutions were saying, which is liberalize. You've gone a certain distance down the road towards a market-based economy. Keep on moving in that direction. Get the state more and more out of the economy. Eventually, relax controls on capital movements. Let the currency values be determined by market forces. Allow the private sector to expand. Do what we thought China was going to do 20 some years ago when we let him into the World Trade Organization. And people have said repeatedly until very recently, they really have no choice. They've kind of bumped up against the limits of this old model. Now they're going to have to do what we said to do all along. Well, not so fast. What the regime seems to be headed towards is a different approach. And it's one that I think emphasizes technological innovation, perhaps above any other factor, pushing technological innovation, pushing what some refer to as the fourth industrial revolution, robotics, artificial intelligence, to obtain increasing increments of productivity. So increase the output per person that the economy can generate, even as that working age bulge that drove the first phases of China's growth back to the 70s and 80s begins to shrink. So technological innovation as the key to sustaining economic growth by increasing productivity. I think that's really the core. And I believe there are at least two other elements. One, the party keeps saying that it's going to increase domestic consumption. They keep declaring this as a goal. They have not been very successful in getting there. And I think part of the reason is that if they really were serious about it, it would mean shifting a significant portion of China's total output into the hands of private citizens and private actors, and that threatens the party's monopoly on political power. That has to be at least part of the reason why they just haven't done that more dramatically. So what I think they will still try to do that, and they probably will make some progress on it. But it's technological innovation and continuing to push exports into the advanced industrial markets for as long as those countries will allow you to do it. And that's what they're trying to do now to keep growth healthy. But the other piece, which I think is a longer term element in their strategy, is to seek out and develop other markets, in particular in the developing world, in the so-called global South. I think Chinese economic strategists hope that in the long term, so over decades, if the global South or parts of it develop and as incomes rise there, this can become a new or an expanding market for Chinese output that will eventually reduce the reliance on the West and increase China's engagement with and reliance on the markets of countries which may be aligned with it politically and in other ways as well. So I think that's the strategy: investment investment in technology to increase productivity, and shifting the focus of China's exports towards markets which are not saturated with their goods. Plus, yes, we want to increase domestic consumption, but as I said, there seem to be political obstacles to doing that very fast. Whether that's going to succeed or not is another question. For the moment, it's mixed, and I think the significance of technology in this plan is one of the reasons why the regime has been so sensitive to the beginning of serious controls on technology exports. That is what they're really worried about and what they would like to head off, because that strikes right at the heart of this long-term economic strategy.
Can you briefly describe China's Belt and Road Initiative, and how is that going for them currently?
Belt and Road Initiative is something that was announced by Xi Jinping in 2013, and which has taken shape over time. Initially, it appeared to be primarily an infrastructure development program of massive proportions. So building bridges, railroads, pipelines that extended outwards from China overland across Eurasia, and then building ports and expanding China's maritime marine and so on down through the Indian Ocean, around to the Persian Gulf, around the waters of Africa. So a massive infrastructure program. And the purposes of that appear to have been first, although I don't think primarily, but to find an outlet for China's accumulation of capital as a result of running these massive surpluses, to basically a full employment plan for China's construction industry. So, yeah, if they're building up to the point where they can't build any more bridges and roads in China, we're going to build them in Africa or in other places. So partly, I think, for economic reasons in that sense. I believe the purpose has also been in part strategic, to increase connectivity between China and the rest of the world, so as to increase China's defenses against the possibility of being blockaded and potentially cut off in the context of a conflict with the United States. And the overland transport routes, I think, are intended to help in that regard, although they don't solve the problem. And the maritime portion of the Belt and Road also, I think, has strategic motivations. It puts China in control of ports that run from its own coasts all the way out to the mouth of the Persian Gulf, around the Indian Ocean, around the periphery of Africa, into the Mediterranean, and into the Atlantic coasts off Europe. It doesn't provide them with an absolute assurance that they can get what they want in the event of some kind of crisis or confrontation, but being in control of that, I think, increases their sense of security. So that's been the plan. It's pretty clear that this has run into difficulties. First, it appears that there isn't as much money available as there might have been once, and partly due to the slowdown in China's growth. So they can't just keep pumping out money and lending it to other countries and then, getting it repaid in one way or another. So it's partly that. I think there's also begun to be something of a pushback against some aspects of this project, because it's involved countries that are borrowing money from China in so-called debt traps. This idea of debt trap diplomacy. China lends you money, you use the money to pay a Chinese company to build a port. Then you have to repay it. If you can't repay it, you may have to hand over the control of the port or repay the Chinese company in natural resources, for example. And that has been part of the program, and that's attracted attention. People in the West have tried to call attention to it, but people in some parts of the developing world that have been on the receiving end of this have also begun to notice that the effects are not entirely positive. So there's become more resistance to it. So less money, more resistance. But I don't think the idea is dead. They still have need for that infrastructure. But also, it looks like the Belt and Road program was always more than just an infrastructure program. It was intended to gain access to other societies, particularly in the developing world, to establish business relationships between Chinese companies and local companies, to establish political connections between local political figures and the Chinese party state, and to gain access and influence in that way. In the case of developing countries, this is particularly evident in Africa, to cultivate rising elites by bringing people back to China to study, whether it's military officers, police, political figures, media, and in that way to extend China's influence in the developing world. And that seems to be going apace. That's relatively inexpensive by comparison. I guess the one other thing to mention, and it's somewhere in between these old-fashioned, bridges and tunnels and the subtle people-to-people diplomacy, and that's the infrastructure for telecommunications. And there, Chinese companies have been very successful. They were early on the scene. They offered cell phone systems in places where they hadn't existed before, and they offered cell phones at prices that were very competitive. And so they've built a not trivial portion of the IT networks of many countries in the developing world. And they're continuing to build those out. And that makes commercial sense, but it also gives the Chinese party state some access to information. It may enable the elements of the party state to surveil the local populations or political leaders. Chinese companies have been building so-called smart cities, so networks of CCTV cameras and artificial intelligence to identify individuals and so on, and offering this to often not very democratic regimes in some of these countries as a way of ensuring their own security. But of course, it also gives China access to information about those societies. So those things are going on, the sort of the soft and then the IT, the high-tech infrastructure, even if the pace at which they're building this big, heavy stuff has slowed down.
A lot of people go to the Cold War analogy to help us understand our current relationship with China or other nations' relationship with China. And I'm of the personal opinion, I think that it's helpful insofar as it goes, but it fails in a lot of important ways. But use that only here as a framing to talk about a foreign policy question. We're not engaged in a hot war with China, at least, certainly not yet. There is, of course, we hear continually about the prospect of China would like to absorb Taiwan. There's questions of whether or not the United States would come to the defense and aid of Taiwan. What do you think the prospects are for some kind of a hot conflict between either China and the United States or China and the West more generally?
Well, if I could just first on this comparison to the Cold War, and I agree with you, it's useful up to a point. It breaks down. But, comparisons are useful both for what they reveal of what's similar, but also what they illuminate about what's different. So I've never understood why people were so averse. Well, I think I know why people were so averse even to talking in this way. But certainly if you look at if a Cold War, maybe with a small c and a small w, is a rivalry between at least two countries and maybe two blocs that plays itself out across a whole array of domains. So diplomatic, economic, technological, military, ideological. This is a Cold War. I think the CCP leadership certainly sees it in that way, even though they busily accuse people in the West who are advocating stiffer policies for dealing with them of being Cold Warriors or having a Cold War mentality. They don't want us to have a Cold War mentality because they don't want us to be competing even more vigorously with them. There clearly are differences. People have noted these, not least the degree of economic interdependence between us and them, which, as I said earlier, was not the case with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, capital C, capital W. So it's similar in certain respects, different in others. The question of whether the Cold War becomes hot, it's a real one. You can't eliminate that as a possibility. I guess I should say there are other things short of that which are beginning to happen. Essentially proxy conflicts where we on the one side and maybe our allies are supporting one party and China is perhaps supporting other parties which are engaged in conflict with the people who are relying on us. That's essentially what's happening in Ukraine. Russia is getting a lot of support from China, maybe not large quantities of weapons, but in economic terms, China is critical to maintaining Russia's economy and also to its ability to build weapons that rely on semiconductors, which they're importing in large quantities from sort of third parties. They're being shipped through Kazakhstan or Malaysia or something like that, but they're coming from China and winding up in Russia. In the Middle East now, China is the largest importer of Iranian oil. even though there are embargoes that have been imposed on Iran. The Chinese have found ways of circumventing those. And of course, Iran is self-supporting various other groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. And that keeps allies and friends of the United States tied up in conflict and distracts the United States from other issues, particularly in the Asia Pacific. So I think we're close to being in proxy conflicts right now, even though American forces on the one hand and Chinese forces on the other are not directly engaged. But what about the possibility that they might come directly into collision? And here, as you said, the scenario that everybody is focused on is Taiwan. And with good reason. If you had to pick one place where the odds of direct confrontation between China and the United States are not trivially small, it would be over Taiwan. But how do we assess the current risk? And is it increasing or is it decreasing? So I would say two things to start. One is, in my view, there's little question that the risk is increasing and has been increasing over time. And that's both because China's military capabilities have grown. So 20 and 30 years ago, China really didn't have the capacity to even take a shot at conquering and dominating Taiwan. And so the likelihood that they would try was vanishingly small. Their military capabilities have grown enormously since then. So the risks have inevitably gone up because the possibility that they might think that they could do this and succeed are greater than they were in the past. And that trend is going to continue because China is continuing to pour resources into its military, and some portion of that is focused on Taiwan and preparing for a Taiwan contingency. The other reason why I think one needs to be more concerned about the prospects for conflict over Taiwan is what's happened on Taiwan over this same period of time. Again, go back to the 90s. The CCP leadership had some reason to hope that they might be able to persuade people on Taiwan or some political parties on Taiwan to move closer and closer to maybe accept, one country, two systems, or some kind of arrangement that would give the mainland effective control over Taiwan. But that prospect, I think, has gone by the boards because of the evolution of Taiwan's polity and the attitudes of people on Taiwan towards the mainland. The numbers of people on Taiwan who say they still want unification have dwindled almost to nothing. The numbers of people who want to maintain the status quo have grown. There's a very small number of people who say they want actual independence, but the trends are not favorable to the CCP. And this recent election is just further confirmation of that. The DPP party winning the presidency for the third time, which is unprecedented. And DPP has been, of the major Taiwanese political parties, the strongest opponent of any suggestion of accepting reunification or unification with the mainland. And so that's an indication of political sentiment. And that's worrisome from Beijing's perspective. So is this all going to blow up? I think there has been a tendency in the last couple of years in the United States in particular to fixate on this scenario, perhaps to a greater degree than it deserves. I mean, accepting what I said earlier, that the risk is growing over time. Some people were saying, including some people in the U.S. military, that the risk of war would increase dramatically in 2027 because the CCP leadership had identified that year as the one at which they would achieve certain milestones in the buildup of their military capabilities. And that was interpreted as an indication that they intended, once they got to that point, to immediately use force against Taiwan. I think that was a misunderstanding of the meaning of those goalposts in the rhetoric of the party. I think the likelihood in the near term that the CCP leadership is going to initiate conflict with Taiwan is probably still pretty low, if only because the risks of doing that are so large. Nobody knows once a war begins how it's going to evolve. And if China uses force against Taiwan, they have good reason to think that the United States would become engaged. And if that happened, China and the United States might, in fact, be involved in a hot war. And the consequences of that are just incalculable. I mean, even if there weren't nuclear exchanges, there would be massive disruptions to trade and huge costs for everybody. It isn't to say that the Chinese leadership wouldn't be willing to pay that price if they absolutely felt they had to, if they felt that they were going to be humiliated in some way, that Taiwan was going to declare independence. Maybe they would take that risk. But I think the likelihood that they would do that from kind of a cold start is pretty low. And perhaps we fixated on that to an excessive extent. I do think from the CCP leadership's point of view, winning without fighting, this idea from Sun Tzu's Art of War, is still the desired outcome, even though the formula for doing that is becoming less and less clear. Because the last thing I would say is there are contingencies between, whatever it is we're calling the current status quo, which is not exactly peace, but not hot war between the mainland and Taiwan, and World War III, in which the United States is directly engaged in conflict with China, in which China might use force, displays of force in limited increments to try to put greater and greater pressure on Taiwan, and also to try to put pressure on everybody else, including us, by conveying the message that if we're not careful, if we don't restrain Taiwan or force Taiwan to do things that they don't want to do in dealings with the mainland, then all bets are off, and China may do things that will result in conflict. We've seen, going back, for example, to August 2022, of former Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and the very large-scale military exercises that China undertook at that time, a ratcheting up of these displays of force. In the past, if you go back to the 90s, China displayed its displeasure with political developments on Taiwan by doing pretty dangerous things like launching unarmed ballistic missiles into the waters off Taiwan that forced disruptions in maritime traffic. They haven't quite done that recently, but they have much more capability to do things like that. Or, and this is the scenario that I think some professionals have become more concerned with, imposing some kind of blockade. They wouldn't declare it as a blockade because that's an act of war and international law, but doing things to disrupt air and maritime traffic into Taiwan on a sustained basis that would impose real economic costs on what is, after all, an island that relies on imports of many things to sustain its livelihood. So that would be an intermediate scenario, one in which China hadn't fired a shot necessarily, certainly hadn't fired a shot at Americans, but they were doing things that imposed greater and greater costs on the people of Taiwan, and which put the friends of Taiwan, including the United States, in a position of having to decide if they were willing to take the next step and contemplate the use of force to break a blockade like that. That, I think, that's a worrisome, to me, a more worrisome scenario than tomorrow waking up to find that the PRC is trying to invade Taiwan.
You've mentioned how we've talked a lot about that potential risk in Taiwan. What do you think is the biggest risk posed by China that we're not talking enough about?
Well, it's hard to identify the one that we're not talking enough about, because in contrast to the past, people are talking about everything under the sun.
What do you think is not getting enough attention then?
I guess the economic, technological, and kind of political warfare challenges that China poses are, I think, in proportion to the military threat, they may even be more important. And yet, when you look at least at the American system, at the U.S. government, the proportion of the resources of the U.S. government that are devoted to thinking about and dealing with the military threat in relation to all of those other things is wildly uneven. And that's because we have a Defense Department, we have big armed services and so on. We don't have a Department of Political Warfare or counter-political warfare. We don't have a Department of Economic Warfare. And yet, I think the threats or the challenges that China is posing to the United States and to the West in each of those domains are significant and growing. Political warfare, the extent to which the CCP, through the use of its so-called United Front organizations and tactics, has succeeded in gaining access to elites and influential people in advanced democratic societies throughout the West, including in the United States, and are trying to use that access to shape the perceptions and ultimately to shape the policies of people in democratic countries. That's something that people in the West were not paying attention to until the last 5-6 years. And that kind of burst into view because of things that happened in Australia in 2017. But that activity had been underway for decades. So we're still wrestling with the full extent of that activity. It poses real challenges to us because it takes advantage of what we regard as our greatest strength, which is our openness, and seeks to exploit that openness and turn it against us. And we have to find ways of dealing with it that don't undermine or run counter to our values and don't sacrifice that openness out of fear of something which is hard to assess and hard to measure, but is nonetheless real. So that's the political warfare part of things. And I think, again, we're just getting started in thinking through how we deal with that. The technological piece, again, is one where awareness of the implications of continuing with the status quo or continuing with the policies that we've pursued up until 5, 6, 7 years ago is no longer safe. It's no longer acceptable and doesn't serve our strategic interests and even is damaging potentially to our economic interests. Again, we've just started in that relatively brief period of time to scrutinize more closely the investments by Chinese companies in advanced companies in the United States. And it's not just the US. The European governments, government in Japan, doing similar things, screening much more carefully these bids or attempts to buy up companies in order to get access to the technology that's embodied in them. We've just started to impose serious restrictions on exports of certain products, most notably the sort of high-end semiconductors and the equipment that's needed to manufacture them. We weren't doing any of that until a few years ago. And I think most people who follow this would say we need to do similar things in other areas of technology, which are still at the sort of nascent stage, or their full implications haven't become clear, but which will have an enormous impact on industry, commerce, but also on national security, like biotechnology as an example, or new and renewable sources of energy, where we've just woken up to learn that we've allowed China to become the dominant processor, if not producer, of a whole array of minerals, which are essential to batteries, which are the key to parts of the so-called energy transition. And we did that because it sort of made economic sense. It also made kind of ecological sense from our perspective. Doing a lot of this stuff is dirty and pollutes, and why should we do it here in the United States or in the advanced societies? Well, let China do that. But if we do, as we have, we may find ourselves heavily dependent and maybe even totally dependent on China to supply those materials and those products. And one thing we learned in the course of the COVID pandemic is that being dependent in that way on a potentially hostile government for equipment that you need to deal, in that case, with an infectious disease, can be dangerous because they may not give you what you need, or they may extract or attempt to extract some benefit from that. And so there's again, short term, is relatively recent, much more awareness of the implications of dependence on China for a variety of materials and manufactured products. There too, we're just at the beginning of assessing what that means and figuring out ways of dealing with it, because it will not be cheap and it will involve government intervention. And we have, for good reasons, tried over the years to limit the extent to which the government is involved in economic planning or pumping money into this industry or that. Well, I think we're past that now because we've had to move past it in order to respond to a challenge, a threat from a society that's operating according to very different principles. So political warfare, the technology race, if you like, and also the broader implications of economic interdependence, those are all issues that require more focus and more attention, and they require strategy, not just a policy here and a policy there. So to the extent that we've reacted to the growing awareness of those challenges, we've done it in a pretty sporadic way. Activity here, but not there. We don't know, is it going to be sustained? What if there's a change of administration? Will we continue with that? And moreover, in all of those areas, our ability in the United States to respond effectively to the challenges in each of those domains is going to depend on cooperation with other like-minded societies and other advanced industrial democracies. We're not going to be successful in building defenses entirely on our own. And we've started to cooperate more closely with our friends and allies in each of these areas, but we're still at an early stage in doing that. And we face real challenges in each of these areas because of the nature of our political system and because of the nature of our allies and our relationship with our allies. So that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but I would say it's kind of, yes, the military, very important, but all of these other things also, and they deserve more attention and more resources than perhaps they've been given.
Aaron L. Friedberg is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. His most recent book is Getting China Wrong, which was released in paperback in August 2023. Aaron, thanks so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Thank you for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Kohn.